Hello, and welcome to our refresher on the chronic homeless definition and its documentation requirements. My name is Ebony Farrell, and I am a compliance coordinator with Strategies to End Homelessness. Our hope in providing these trainings virtually is that they will offer a better opportunity for the community to be able to attend these on their own time and with less trouble. Today we're going to briefly review HUD's chronic homeless definition, along with HUD's documentation requirements and why they are important. We'll also discuss how participants' eligibility with regard to their chronic homeless status is documented in our continuum of care. Some of this has changed with the HMIS transition from VESTA to Clarity. We have seen in monitoring visits that many agencies are unclear about what documentation they need to satisfy HUD's requirements, and so we want to make sure that it is clear to everybody, since chronic homeless documentation is documentation that proves that the participant is eligible for the program. Let's start off with why HUD created the definition of chronic homeless. They recognized that there was a population of hard-to-serve people who were spending long periods of time living in shelters or in places not fit for human habitation. Defining who fits into this group helps to ensure that those with the longest history of homelessness and the most severe needs are able to be prioritized. Every year, HUD puts out a Notice of Funding Availability, or a NOFA. This announces the next round of COC funding that can be applied for and further specifies the rules that govern the use of that funding. HUD also clarifies regulations through notices. The term chronically homeless was first introduced in the fiscal year 2002 COC NOFA and has been expanded and clarified through some subsequent NOFAs and notices and the final rule. They are listed on this slide in case you would like to look them up. You've seen this definition before, but it is helpful to review it. A person is chronically homeless if they have a qualifying disability and currently live in a place not fit for human habitation, safe haven, or emergency shelter, and have either lived in any or all of those places continuously for at least 12 months, or for a total of at least 12 months on at least 4 separate occasions in the last 3 years. HUD considers a break in homelessness to be at least 7 nights. So if someone was staying in a shelter for 2 months, then left to stay with a friend for 3 nights, then returned to the shelter for 2 more months, that would count as 4 continuous months. But if they stayed at their friend's house for 7 nights before returning to the shelter, it would count as 4 months, but 2 separate occasions. A stay of fewer than 90 days in an institution such as jail or an inpatient mental health facility does not constitute a break, and the period of time spent in an institution counts towards the total amount of time homeless if less than 90 days and immediately preceded by actual homelessness as I just described. So if someone was living on the street for 2 months, then incarcerated for 2 months, their length of time homeless upon release from jail would be 4 months. Participants do not, however, retain their chronically homeless status if they enter transitional housing. Although persons in transitional housing are considered homeless for the annual point-in-time count that we report to HUD, they do not meet the criteria of paragraph 1 of HUD's definition, which is emergency shelter, safe haven, place not fit for human habitation, or an institution where they have been for fewer than 90 days, which was immediately preceded by actual homelessness. Any stay of 7 nights or more in transitional housing would constitute a break and does not count toward a person's length of time homeless for the purpose of establishing chronicity. If a person is exiting an institution after residing there for fewer than 90 days, and they met the definition on the previous slide prior to entering, then they still meet the definition of chronically homeless upon exit from the institution if they are exiting to homelessness. If an adult head of household meets all of the criteria on either of the previous two slides, the household as a whole qualifies as chronically homeless. This must be one person who meets all of the criteria. If one adult has the disability and the other has the 12 months of homelessness, that does not add up to a chronically homeless household. If there are no adults in the household, a minor head of household can qualify as chronically homeless. It is not necessary for the other members to have been with the qualifying head of household throughout the duration of their homelessness. Although most of this presentation is focused on the first part of the chronic homelessness definition, which is time spent as paragraph 1 homeless, a person must also have a qualifying disability in order to meet the definition of chronic homelessness. Qualifying disability for the purpose of chronic homelessness is the same as for general permanent supportive housing eligibility. So now we'll move on to documentation. HUD requires that all agencies have written policies and procedures to ensure that programs are operating in compliance with COC regulations. In addition to this general requirement, HUD specifies certain details that must be addressed in your policies and procedures. One such detail is that your written policies and procedures must require documentation at intake of the evidence relied upon to verify homeless status, including chronic homeless status. This may mean printing or creating a PDF of an HMIS record of homelessness, obtaining other documentation from a referring shelter or street outreach program, or documenting self-certification by the participant. Another specific detail that must be included in your written policies and procedures is establishment of the priority for obtaining evidence of homelessness. First priority must be third-party documentation. This can be an HMIS record, which we'll discuss in more detail later, or a written observation by a third party, such as an outreach worker. It is not necessary that the person be a homeless service provider. For example, it could also be a police officer or a business owner who has personally observed the participant's sleeping situation. A single documented encounter in a month is enough to count the whole month, unless there is evidence of a break of more than 7 days. Second priority is intake worker observation. Intake worker observation is acceptable as the next best form of documentation only if all reasonable efforts to obtain third-party documentation have been made, were unsuccessful, and have been documented in the participant record. This is really only possible to verify the participant's homeless status at intake, and would mean that the intake worker would go physically to see where the person is sleeping and certify that they saw them living in a place not meant for human habitation on a given date. An intake worker writing down the participant's report of their sleeping situation is not sufficient. Clearly, you cannot observe what has happened in the past, so intake worker certification cannot be used to document where the participant has slept in past months. Intake worker certification must be accompanied by a written account of what efforts have been made to obtain third-party documentation and should be accompanied by a self-certification signed by the participant that corroborates the intake worker's observation. Third priority is self-certification. If third-party and intake worker observation documentation are not possible to obtain, the participant can sign a self-declaration detailing the specific location and dates as well as they can remember in each sleeping location. HUD allows up to 3 months of self-certified homelessness for all participants in permanent supportive housing projects. If at least 9 months of homelessness, cumulative or continuous, cannot be obtained by third-party documentation or intake worker certification, up to the full 12 months can be documented via self-certification only. This is limited to rare and extreme cases and cannot be for any more than 25% of households served by the permanent supportive housing project in the project's operating year. In order to determine that a participant has been homeless for a continuous 12-month period or 4 separate instances in a 3-year period, you need to look at breaks of 7 nights or more. Breaks can be documented by third-party documentation, but this is not required. All breaks can be documented by self-certification. Documenting a stay of fewer than 90 days in an institution follows the same priority of documentation as time spent in a place not meant for human habitation, emergency shelter, or safe haven. Third-party documentation such as discharge paperwork is preferred, but stays in institutions can be documented by self-certification by the participant. So as I mentioned before, the documentation for a qualifying disability for the purpose of establishing chronic homelessness status is the same as is required for permanent supportive housing eligibility. Acceptable documentation includes written verification from a professional licensed by the state to diagnose and treat the disability that certifies that the disability is expected to be long-term or of indefinite duration, substantially impedes their ability to live independently, and could be improved by housing. Please note that the guidance that I have received is that a MSW alone is not licensure to diagnose and treat a disability, and that in the state of Ohio, a LSW still needs supervision from a LISWS. A Social Security letter that confirms the person's disability-related benefits is a second form of acceptable documentation. There must be something on the letter that indicates that these benefits are SSI or SSDI, since the Social Security Administration also deals with survivors' benefits and other benefits that would not be proof of a disability. And then finally, receipt of a disability check is also an acceptable form of disability documentation. If you do not have one of the above forms of documentation at intake, the regulations do allow intake workers to record their observation of a disability as temporary disability documentation. However, acceptable documentation does need to be obtained and placed in the participant record within 45 days of intake. Personally, I would not recommend using this flexibility unless you are absolutely certain that the proper documentation can be obtained. So now that we've covered the definition of chronic homelessness and HUD's documentation requirements, let's now look at how things work in our continuum of care. In 2016, after the final rule was published, all permanent supportive housing projects had chronic homeless dedicated beds, meaning that coordinated entry prioritized chronically homeless households for permanent supportive housing project placement. Last year, the COC adopted Dedicated Plus prioritization, which still prioritizes the chronically homeless, but now also provides more guidance on prioritizing other vulnerable individuals and families that do not meet all of the criteria in the chronic homelessness definition. The following are the essential elements of documenting eligibility in terms of chronic homelessness status in our continuum of care. First is the coordinated entry referral, which I'll discuss in the next slide. Second is the verification or the obtaining of documentation. And third is maintaining the chronic homelessness documentation tracker. When coordinated entry refers a chronically homeless participant to a program, the referral email describes what documentation has been used to identify the participant's chronic homelessness status. The housing program is responsible for ensuring that this documentation is correct and present in the participant's record. The referral email alone does not meet the chronic homelessness documentation requirements. If there are no eligible chronically homeless participants available for referral, the coordinated entry referral email contains a certification of non-chronically homeless placement. This must be retained in the participant record as documentation of the participant's eligibility. To be clear, all permanent supportive housing records must either have sufficient documentation of chronic homelessness or a certification of non-chronically homeless placement. If neither is present, the participant is not eligible for the program. Some participants may have all of their months and episodes of homelessness documented in HMIS. In clarity, a participant's homeless history is found in the Verification of Homelessness report. This is the same report that you use to document that the participant was homeless at intake and move-in. To run this report, start in the participant's profile screen, click on the printer icon, and you will get a list of client-level reports. Next, you'll click Run next to the Verification of Homelessness report. You'll now fill in the date range, select PDF as the format, and click Submit. When it is ready, you'll get a pop-up notification, and you can access it by clicking on that notification or on the Report Queue icon. The report has 2 pages. The first page with the X's is what you will use to document a participant's time spent as paragraph 1 homeless. The second page with the dates is the one you will use to document that the person was homeless at intake and move-in. On this report, documented street shelter and documented break are third-party documentation. Printing or PDFing this report satisfies HUD's requirement for third-party documentation as long as there are sufficient months and instances. Self-reported street shelter and self-reported potential break mean that they were reported by the participant at intake. This does not take the place of a self-certification signed by the participant. If the referring agency does not send over the self-certification, you need to get the participant to sign one for any month that is to be counted. If the participant qualifies as chronically homeless because of one continuous period of at least 12 months of homelessness, and there is an X in the self-reported potential break column, you should look for any documentation in the participant record and ask the participant if they were staying somewhere other than a shelter, safe haven, or place not meant for human habitation for at least 7 nights. If there is no evidence of a break, you don't need to ask the participant about it. In other words, you should do your due diligence to investigate clear indications that the participant was not homeless for 12 continuous months, but do not search for disqualifications where there is no indication that they exist. If the participant qualifies as chronically homeless because of 4 instances in the past 3 years, adding up to at least 12 months, and there are not 3 breaks documented in HMIS, you will want to work with the participant to identify and document when the breaks occurred. Please note that if HMIS does not document sufficient months or episodes of homelessness, the housing program must obtain and piece together the missing documentation to confirm eligibility. This may mean following up with the street outreach worker or third party, or having the participant sign a self-certification for the undocumented months that they were homeless. As you may be contacting agencies that are still using VESTA, it is important to note that while a shelter certification in VESTA details the exact length of stay, A street outreach certification does not. Since street outreach certifications can stay active for 3 months after the initial contact, regardless of whether additional encounters occurred, they are not reliable documentation of the number of months that a participant spent in a place not meant for human habitation. If a participant is referred as chronically homeless, but review of their documentation indicates that they were not in fact chronically homeless, you should contact Coordinated Entry for guidance. Per HUD regulations, a project should not have more than 25% of chronically homeless participants whose chronic homelessness status relies on self-certification for more than 3 of their 12 months. In order to document compliance with this regulation, all permanent supportive housing projects should maintain a chronic homelessness tracker. As I mentioned in the previous slide, if a participant has been referred as chronically homeless, but you are unable to obtain documentation that supports their designation as chronically homeless, you must contact Coordinated Entry. It is not appropriate to keep it to yourself and just leave them off the tracker, or to intake them with insufficient documentation. The requirement to maintain the tracker is not new, but there has been some misunderstanding in the past about the importance of maintaining it and exactly what information should be included. A separate tracker is required for each permanent supportive housing project. To HUD, a project is a particular grant. At the agency level, multiple projects may be operated as one project, but HUD requires separate trackers for every grant that supports that project. The tracker is a snapshot of all of the participants you have served or are serving in the current operating year who were referred as chronically homeless. It should be kept up to date at all times, so every time you receive a new chronically homeless referral, the referral should be added. At the beginning of an operating year, you should remove any participants who have exited. Previous year's trackers must be maintained to satisfy record retention requirements. Whether you maintain different versions as separate tabs in one file or as separate files is up to you. Third-party months documented is where you would enter the number of months in HMIS, plus any additional months documented by a different third-party source. Worker months would be the rare instance where the intake worker actually observed the place where the participant was sleeping and documented it, along with obtaining self-certification by the participant. Self-certified months would be the months that you have a signed self-declaration from the participant. As a reminder, an X in the self-reported column on the HMIS report does not count as documentation of any kind. As you can see, only one participant in this project is relying on self-certification for more than 3 months. So this is the only participant who counts against the 25% cap. Even though Lyme has 4 months of self-certification, this doesn't count against the cap because only 2 of those months are needed to add up to 12 months. This project is compliant with HUD's cap. If your project exceeds the 25% cap, you should contact Coordinated Entry prior to completing the intake of the participant that put the project over the 25% cap. We have added an extra date column to the tracker to make it easier for you to see at a glance who should be removed at the beginning of the next operating year. So there you have it. That's the definition and what is required. We realize that this can get a bit complicated when you get into the documentation requirements. However, it is really important that we get it right as it is an eligibility requirement for permanent supportive housing. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions. Thank you.